Yo, what's good people? It's TooBizyGaming, we're live, we're direct, and we are in full effect. Now, I know it has been a very long time, but I am back and I couldn't be happier to be back covering a game that I am eagerly anticipating. Yes, this is Granblue Fantasy Relink, and luckily we got invited to play the game nice and early, get our hands on time with some multiplayer, single player, and get some visuals with the true Endgame. Massive shout out to 4 Media Group and the Cygames team for sending us that invite. So without further ado, let's get into this and discuss some stuff regarding the game. Now, just some quick thoughts on the game. You lot know what type of games we like to cover on this channel. I love RPG games and I love games where you get to really optimize and think about how you want to play the game. Not just the game, but the character as well. If the character is a tank, but you want to optimize a loadout that increases enmity, for example, or it outputs more damage, or you get to look after your team a bit better. This game does exactly that. It is rich in graphics, it has co-op mode, it has a crazy story mode, it has some amazing lore, and a company that seems to have just outputted a love letter to their fan base with this game. Now, if you like combat as well, this game will deliver in that department. And if you like crazy bosses, now I'm talking some real end game bosses. For those who have played Monster Hunter, I struggled against them as well, Extremoth. Or if you play Final Fantasy 14 and you have done some crazy trials and some of the bosses have some unreal gimmicks, this game is going to sit at the top of the list. And of course, gameplay, mechanics, and all of that fun stuff aside, the story, as I mentioned, is rich with lore and a few new characters that we can't talk about just yet. But listen, you lot will enjoy the story just as much as I did with our playthrough time. So let's talk about it. Now for the main story, it is a single player campaign focused on not just the characters, but the settings, the relationship, and more. Now, whilst playing this single player campaign and having some hands-on time with the hub world and getting to run around and view some of the characters and just interact with them, it actually made me understand who is who and what role they play on the team. Now, this was vital for me as somebody who doesn't really know too much about the Granblue universe, but is interested to just understand what some of the characters do and how they might have met Gran and how they may have joined the team. Now, whilst playing it, I didn't want to spoil too much of the story for myself, so I ended up skipping a fair bit of the cutscenes. However, when it came down to the simple single interactions with the characters in the hub world, that was where I started to read through and understand what type of character Gran might be interacting with or what role they might play on the team. Now, as I mentioned, it is a single player campaign. However, when you play through the story, you do unlock multiplayer quests, and these missions can be played together and will be unlocked throughout playing the story. Now that we've got the brief intro about the main story and touching on the multiplayer side, let's talk about one of my favorite parts about the game, which is the combat system. Now, the combat at the start seems a bit basic. Obviously, when you're running around with Gran and you got the intro and you learn one of his special moves and you're understanding aerial combos and all this different stuff, it gets complex. Now, as you level the character up, like I mentioned, it seems a bit basic, but it does hint at complex combos that you will be able to unlock and special moves that are drip fed through progression. Now, the game combat has similarities to Bayonetta, Metal Gear Solid Rising, Nier Automata, and of course, with the amazing and fresh art styles that the game offers, it has a complexity of Monster Hunter and, like I mentioned, Final Fantasy. Now, some of the special moves that you do unlock for each character, it doesn't have to solely be DPS based. You can have things that increase your armor, things that give you super armor, invincibility, a healing field, or just makes you and your team completely invincible for a set amount of time. Now, that is where the combat begins to get a little bit complex, as if you're playing with a well-known team, a group of friends, and you want to work on a specific build, then that is when you start to communicate the type of route that you're taking with your character. And then this goes into the character differences and some of the builds. Now, to bridge the gap between the combat and the character builds, I almost exclusively played Vaseraga throughout my playtime. Now, if you don't know anything about me, I love to play big, tanky characters that are difficult to kill, have tons of HP, loads of defense, and dish out shed loads of damage. Now, these type of characters tend to be slow, beefy, can't really get in and out of the fight as quick as some of the other characters, but I also love it when other people just completely underestimate these type of characters. Now, in another video, I will be talking about what I learned from playing some of the other characters, but just talking about Vaseraga for now, there was different accessories that I could equip to the character that raised his enmity or lowered the the charge time, so it allowed me to dish out more damage at a quicker rate. That type of stuff is where the builds and the combat actually felt a little bit smoother. So instead of being such a slow and beefy character when dishing out damage, I ended up having the character be able to charge moves a lot quicker or get his special moves back a lot quicker. And that is what made him on par with some of the more crazier DPS characters. And of course, when we did some of the bigger bosses, I chose to go for the more defensive approach. So something that not only offered myself invincibility or super armor, hyper armor, but it dished out that same hyper armor to my teammates. And there was another move that also allowed Vaseraga to take on the HP that was damaged to my friends. Actually, he took all of that damage, and that is what made the character complexity and builds a lot more interesting. As I mentioned, I almost exclusively played Vaseraga for my entire time there, but I did give Siegfried a try. Character looks amazing. He's got the giant sword and armor just looks evil. That's my type of character as well, I can't lie. Now, playing Siegfried and of course Gran throughout the story mode segment of the event and Vaseraga, I realized how different all of the characters actually are. Where some might think that it is simply a 2-button game, this is something that has tons of complexity when it comes to the character differences. Some characters have different button timings or build special meters which differentiate one another to stop the feeling of a simple Musu game. Now, for example, Siegfried, when executing his simple combos, there was a specific timing that you would have to press square, which you would see a light indication on the screen when it flashed circle or flashed red. If you pressed it at that time, then he will execute an even stronger version of said move. Mixing that with his special attacks made Siegfried an absolute monster. He also had the ability to buff himself with attack buffs and output some crazy projectiles as well. Now, like I mentioned, there will be some other videos that I'll be putting out there, and one of the videos that I'm really looking forward to showing you is the character breakdown and just some thoughts on some of the other characters that myself and other content creators that were there played. Now that we've gone over the story and some of the characters and builds, I want to talk about the end game, because every RPG fan, you know, after we complete the game, we want more. We want to know how our limits are going to be tested and if we're going to be broken as players in the end. Now, after completing both the story and the end game, you can do post-end game content. That is roughly around 40 to 100 plus hours, which is true end game and gives you some powerful gear to obtain. And this maximizes the builds that you might have been using throughout both the story and the post-game content. Now, just like similar games like Monster Hunter, Final Fantasy, after we've got, well, what we think is the strongest and best build ever, when you do true endgame, that is when you get humbled. Now, Yasuyuki did mention that once you do get to post endgame, it is advised that you play through it as a team, because some of the content is so difficult, the NPCs aren't really going to be able to help you out in some situations. And we were shown some of the endgame sets and builds from some of the best players within their office, and some of the skills that they had equipped was absolutely crazy, which Yasuyuki did mention that you will only get some of this stuff if you pour a lot of hours into the end game and defeat some of the strongest bosses. And one of the bosses that they actually did a battle showcase with was Radis Whiteworm. Now, this is obviously coming from somebody who doesn't know so much about Granblue Fantasy and the universe that it holds, but Radis Whiteworm to me looked absolutely crazy. Some of the abilities that it was doing, some of the moves, it looked like an absolute nuisance. Once again, playing Monster Hunter World and doing Extreme Behemoth, I thought that was the pinnacle of pain, and doing Fatalis and stuff like that, but Radis Whiteworm looked like a headache. Now, Radis was an example of a true endgame boss. However, Yasuyuki did mention that Radis actually isn't one of the real endgame bosses. There's actually bosses that is way harder than him. Now, he inflicts paralysis, grants a lot of buffs, which actually he does as soon as he enters the battlefield, and this is what makes the boss an absolute nuisance. Again, when you're playing with a team that you may have been playing with for a while and you've expressed how your specific character build might play, this is where you can communicate and actually do a lot of damage to the boss and go in there with a Firaz plan and enter the battlefield with a plan to take out Radis or any boss a whole lot easier. Now, some interesting things that we figured out whilst they were playing through the boss was that you can actually go into any of these fights or any of these multiplayer quests with NPCs like I mentioned before. So if it's just you and one other friend and you actually need some assistance with a said enemy, a said dungeon or a said arena, you can get the CPU to fill in the gaps. You can also reduce the party members for a challenge. However, Yasuyuki himself mentioned that it will be a struggle to reach some of that sweet desired endgame loot if you aren't with other players and communicating strategies. And just like all of the other RPGs, when you maximize a build and communicate with your team, no boss is going to be an issue. Take this from somebody who has struggled with Fatalis and many other RPG bosses in the past. And that is it for our first video regarding Granblue Fantasy Rising. Once again, a massive shout out to 4 Media Group and Cygames for the invite. Listen, we got loads more planned, so keep it locked. locked. If you have any questions regarding the game, please let me know down in the comment section below. Subscribe for more, and listen, I will be on this game non-stop trying to get the best build. So if you want to join me, or if you want to teach me some lore, join up on the Discord, follow the Twitch stream. Let's get into this. Listen, it's your boy TooBizyGaming, Vaseraga main, my ad. I'm out of here. Peace.